And I'm going to admit everybody. Hello, welcome everybody. People are strolling in to our virtual event. Hello to everyone out in the land of Facebook. We are live streaming on Zoom for Housing Justice and Measure Z. Feel free to share on your pages and invite your friends to join you in watching. Here we go. Just make sure this is working. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. My name is Grover Wayman Brown and I'm Communications Manager here at East Bay Housing Organization. And EBHO is a member-driven organization that works to preserve, protect, and create affordable housing opportunities for low-income communities in the East Bay through education, advocacy, organizing, and building coalitions. As we all arrive, please put your name, pronouns you like to be called, and if you're joining us from Alameda or some other city, to know who's in the room with us. Okay. Grover. Hello. Thank you, everyone. Welcome, Ronnie, Sarah, Belle. I'm going to put in some headphones. Yes, welcome Matt and Ronnie and Deborah. Deborah, thank you for grounding us in Ohlone territory. It is true. We will get started in 1 minute. We're just waiting for everyone to settle in. Drum roll, and here we go. Thank you everyone for joining us on a Friday morning after a really intense couple of weeks, after a really intense couple of months, after a really intense lifetime of struggle for justice. And today we're talking about the history of housing justice in Alameda and its relationship to Measure Z, which is a measure on the Alameda City ballot in November to repeal an exclusionary zoning charter amendment. EBHO's members include residents of affordable housing. Oh, can everybody mute, please?
You want me to close it?
Hold on. There we go. EBHO's members include residents of affordable housing providers, and everyday advocates for housing justice. We support this repeal because exclusionary zoning drives up the cost of affordable housing by requiring developers to put larger and fewer units on each plot of land to work around the article, even with the affordable housing overlay mandated by the state, and because single-family zoning exacerbates racial segregation. As a housing justice organization, disability justice is embedded in our work. Article 26 incentivizes the building of narrow townhomes with stairs, which are inaccessible to many people with physical disabilities who are more likely to be low income than able-bodied people and face a significant shortage of affordable, accessible housing. There are many more reasons to support the repeal of this article in November and then fight hard for the funding that we need to create the number of affordable homes needed to meet our community's needs for safe, secure, affordable housing. I welcome our guests, Rasheed, Shabazz, and Laura Thomas, to talk to us more about the history that brought us to this moment and what we can do about it. We are honored to have both of them as guests. Rasheed has been a leader in researching and educating about the history of Black residents in Alameda and then also racism and housing in Alameda. Laura Thomas is a vice president of Renewed Hope Housing Advocates and has been part of advocating for affordable housing for decades on the island. We welcome them today. First, I'm going to welcome Rasheed to share information with us. Rasheed.
Awesome, thank you. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the connection between Measure Z and the history of both racist housing policy and resistance to racist housing policy in the City of Alameda. So just switching to the share screen and busy. So I think one of the, all right, so and are you able to see it, everyone?
Yes.
All right, let's go. So today I'm calling this presentation from A to Z, from Measure Z and just connecting racial justice and housing justice. And I think one of the interesting contradictions we're going to see during this election is there are going to be people who say they care about Black lives, are concerned about inclusion and racial justice, but do not support Measure Z. And so what I hope to do today is make that connection between the ways that racial justice is also part of that, a large part of that is a housing justice struggle, and we cannot have housing justice without racial justice. And so just to start off, I'll talk about, a little bit of the context of Alameda historically, but first really, again, just defining exclusionary zoning. I'm going to go through some of the different layers and levels of the racist housing policy in Alameda, and I'm going to try to pay some close attention to some of the ways people have resisted, and then finally just talk about some of the different impacts of Article 26, or Alameda's exclusionary zoning charter amendment, which people have historically called Measure A. And so I may say Article 26, I may slip up and say Measure A, but hopefully it won't be too confusing today. So when people ask me about the impacts of Measure A or Article 26, the things that come to my mind are the continued racial segregation that Alameda has experienced, some of the inequality in home ownership rates in Alameda, and then also the ongoing mass expulsions, largely of Black folks, so larger groups of renters. And so I hope to clearly explain how that's all connected and how Measure A or Article 26 is one historian called it the cornerstone of Alameda's political structure. So again, exclusionary zoning relates to how land is regulated. Zoning can determine what gets built and where, or the type of things that are put somewhere. And so with exclusionary zoning, as we call policies like Article 26, it can regulate or exclude certain land uses by saying what can be built there. So for instance, only single family homes, or if it's single family homes, perhaps there's certain minimal lot sizes that have to happen, or it might be certain setbacks, how large your lawn needs to be. And in the case of Article 26, a 1991 amendment required a maximum maximum amount of density on land. And so ultimately, all of these things have been found by researchers, particularly exclusionary zoning, to have racist impact. And so in the state of California, researchers have found that the more single family zoning that you have in a place or a municipality or a jurisdiction, the more white people will live there. And so, or there's a relationship with there being more white residents there. By contrast, there will be less low income people and then less Black and Latinx folks. And so you can see that from this recent study from the Othering and Belonging Institute, where they compare the land use, so single family zoning, and then the proportion of groups within the city. And as you can see from that yellow line, the more single family zoning you have, the more white people live. I did a similar study this past spring and had similar findings. I just chose to display it differently because I'm still learning how to visualize different things. But this is the racial composition of California cities by the percentage of single-family zoning. And as you can see, the larger the percentage, the more that blue line goes up. And in contrast, we can see that there's less Black residents as well as Latinx or Latino folks. And so that's what happens very generally with exclusionary zoning. And there's also another important factor, which is opposition to housing development. And so what I found when I did this study was that those were the two factors that contributed most to the racial composition of cities. So the percentage of single family zoning and citizen opposition to housing development. And so what you have with Article 26 is both of those. It was the opposition to development, and it was blanketing the entire city of Alameda as single family zoning for construction. And what I tell folks is Article 26 essentially enshrined past practices of restrictive covenants, zone redlining, and government-backed segregation. Not even to mention all of the private discrimination that's happened in Alameda's real estate or housing markets. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today, give you some of that pre-Measure A context, and then talk about what was happening during that time, and then finally what since, up until the 2000s. So when I talk about the history of Alameda, I think about it as layers of policy, layers of practices. And one of the early practices that happened in Alameda, there was first white citizen opposition to who were then called colored people. And then later on, you had restrictive covenants. These were put inside of the deeds of homes. They were legally backed by the courts until 1948. And they said certain people couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. And so that's the first level I'm going to talk about. And you can see in these different graphics, they would explicitly exclude non-Caucasian folks unless they were domestic servants. And then explicitly, in the case of Fernside, Waterside Terrace, and this other place called Fernside Marina, all on the East End, these explicitly excluded Black and certain Asian groups from living there, again, unless they were a servant. So this was in place as early as 1913, and these continued to be on the books until, legally until 1948 when the Supreme Court outlawed them. And in some places, they weren't removed as a clause from homeowners associations until the late 60s, but they are on the deeds today in many homes throughout Alameda. Now, one of the next major layers of housing discrimination, racist housing discrimination, occurred in 1935 with the creation of redlining. So the organization, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, created these maps where they had real estate appraisers go to different neighborhoods and rate them as far as their how much risk a neighborhood had in terms of giving loans. And so areas that had more white people and in fact no non-white people were ranked higher. And so you can see from this map looking to the left, most if not all of Piedmont is rated green, North Berkeley. Other areas in the hills would often be rated blue. You can see in Alameda, if you look on this map to the right, Fernside, Waterside Terrace, and part of the Gold Coast all rated blue. And now some of the areas were rated yellow because you might have a colored family or an Asian family living nearby, or they used to use the terminology infiltration to refer to non-white people coming into an area. what you see on the north side of Alameda, the area that had been zoned industrial, or portions of it zoned industrial, that was the area where you had 76% of black people prior to 1940, and the largest concentration of Chinese and Japanese people in Alameda, or one of the largest concentrations, I'll say that. And so what redlining did was say, hey, these people can get federally backed mortgages, and these other people can't. In fact, these neighborhoods are just not great. And it guided investment and ultimately the intergenerational wealth, as some families were able to get loans and pass these homes down, these assets down to their children, while others were not. So what happened in 1940 was the creation or the construction of the Alameda Naval Air Station, and then later on the creation of Alameda Housing Authority. And they built a number of wartime housing projects that were segregated. And so one of them is still up today. The Woodstock Homes is listed on this map as the letter A. So over there by where the north, the end on the map is. But that's actually still there today, and it's a housing cooperative. And from my research, no black people have ever lived there. A couple people may have stayed with their partner a couple of nights or something, but no one has ever lived there. And so this is an interesting part of the history of segregation in Alameda. These other projects were segregated as well, but this one is still here, and it's providing a lower form of or lower cost form of home ownership that hasn't been extended to everyone here in Alameda. Shortly after World War II, there was some resistance to housing segregation and discrimination, and it was largely led by different workers and people affiliated with the Communist Party. And I think that's part of why they've been written out of the history, and they've also been sort of marginalized at the time. But the resistance to housing segregation and exclusion continued. In the 1950s and 60s, there was a planned shrinkage or the systematic dismantling of this wartime housing projects. And due to the widespread housing discrimination in the city of Alameda, black residents were not able to find housing outside of the projects. And so this led to the population going from 249 in 1940 to over 6,000 by the end of the war. And then by 1970, the population dropped back down to around, I think, 1,500. And so it was a massive influx, as Mayor Godfrey might have called it. And then it was a systematic removal of these folks from the city of Alameda. And it was resisted. And if you saw the flyer for this event, there's an image from one of their many pickets and protests where the black residents protested their exclusion from Alameda. So I wanted to just give some of that context because if you listen to people telling the story of how Alameda is so diverse today, they forget the 2 decades prior to Measure A being passed that led to so many people, particularly black people, being forced out of Alameda. So Measure A, again, really briefly, or what's called Article 26, essentially says there will be no multiple dwelling units or apartments built in Alameda. They made an exception for Alameda Housing Authority replacement, but it's important to remember, these were systematically removed in the 2 decades prior, and something that might have had 1,400 units had been reduced to 800 units. And so if that was replaced, it was not replacing it to the extent that had enabled black people to even move to Alameda. Measure A was modified in 1991 to create a density restriction, and so it limited to 2,000, minimum of 2,000. So I'm getting into some other details, but I just want to share some of the things that were said at the time and briefly go over some of the impacts that have taken place since Article 26. So one of the things that happened, this is the minutes from a group called HOPE, or Housing Opportunities Provided Equally, and they were really concerned about Measure A, and they said they couldn't support a ban on multiples as, quote, it is it's the acknowledged way of providing more low and moderate price housing units. And so it was understood by the primary fair housing advocate group in Alameda that Measure A would be bad for affordable housing. These are 2 leaders that were against Measure A at the time. Al DeWitt, who later became the first Black city council member in the city of Alameda. And these comments are from their endorsements of one of the housing candidates, Gus Levy. But I think their comments about him can reflect some of the sentiment of why they may have been against Measure A at the time. And so the concern about protecting tenants and the concern about racism were heavy on their minds. And lastly, I'll share at the time of Article 26, there were some things that the opponents shared, like what Measure A would do. And these are the things that have happened since. There's been persistent economic and racial segregation. There's been recurring evictions, and there's been multiple legal challenges that have been written out of some of the histories about Alameda. And just one interesting thing I'll say, I don't really get into the intention of Measure A as much. It's interesting that race is not explicitly mentioned in a lot of the documents, but this is one example after the election where it was. And so in the city of San Leandro, if you've ever seen the documentary Suburban Wall, you know about San Leandro at that time. And one of the things that's said here, if you look to the right, is this person who wanted to bring Measure A to San Leandro said, this has nothing to do with race. And so I don't know how that interview with this reporter was, but I think it's really interesting that that was brought up. And that's one of the only instances I've seen it directly referenced. And so I talked about how Measure A has contributed to increased racial segregation. So after 1970 and after Measure A, we see a lot of the white population leaving the city of Alameda, and particularly in a couple neighborhoods. And I'll just point to the one that's highlighted on the west end of the island where you see Woodstock Park, and that's the neighborhood I grew up in. And what really happened in our neighborhood was once white people moved out, Black people and other people of color were able to move in and largely into different apartments. But these apartments were aging, and what would happen is they wouldn't get repairs, the city wouldn't enforce code restrictions, and ultimately we ended up getting forced out. And it's happened multiple times on the west end of Alameda. And so in my last moments, I'll just say that this has all happened, and it hasn't happened without resistance. And so Measure A has been challenged multiple times, led by low-income Black tenants, first in 1980 and then later in 1988. And one of the things that happened with the 1990 settlement was it required the city to replace low-income units. But I think what's most important is the city of Alameda settled a lawsuit about its discriminatory housing policies in order to protect Measure A. And so for whatever reason, there's been this huge push to legally protect Measure A from various different challenges, particularly about it being discriminatory. And I think lastly, I'll just end with these two slides. First, this is showing the disparate home ownership rates in Alameda. And if you look to the slide on the right, you'll see that only 7% of Black people in Alameda own their homes. And this is partially because of the long history of racial segregation and discrimination in the housing market by realtors, and then also because of these other impacts and things like Measure A. And finally, I just contrast the zoning map of the populations in Alameda. So if you look to the left, these areas that are largely gray on this map of Alameda is where there's single family zoning. And then when you look to the right, the areas that predominantly have those dots represent people, and those blue dots represent white people. And so you can clearly see that there is an association between the single family zoning and white residency in the city of Alameda. And so it started with Measure A as far as the exclusionary zoning, and this fall people have a chance to repeal this exclusionary zoning here in Alameda with Measure Z. And so again, I just point to that contradiction. People cannot say that they believe Black Lives Matter or they're concerned with racial justice while not supporting Measure Z. It's a contradiction.
Thank you, Rasheed, for that excellent and very, very helpful presentation. If you have specific questions about the presentation Rasheed just gave, will you please either raise your hand if you'd like to speak or put the question in the chat? No
And I'll
question.
just share that looks like Sophia DeWitt, hello, shared the readings on like racist history in Alameda that Grover was able to compile. So I encourage folks to, read more about some of this history on your own time.
Yes, thank you. Last call. Okay, everyone. Now we get to hear from Laura Thomas, who is the president of Renewed Hope Housing Advocates, about the fight for affordable housing in Alameda. And specifically, Laura has been very active over the last couple of decades, producing the affordable, like fighting for the affordable housing that we currently have in our city is in large part because of the fight from Renewed Hope. So Laura, take it away.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you, Grover and Ebho, for having me here to talk. Yeah, I've been in Alameda, it shocks me, 37 years. I'm actually from Oakland. That's where I grew up. I used to be a newspaper reporter for 30 years, finishing at the Chronicle. I don't have many affiliations, but I'm pretty devoted to the cause of housing. I'm a fifth generation Californian. So I came with the first my ancestors are the first colonizers, and I know that. And when I was young, I would have understood completely why people wanted to vote for Measure A. I would have resisted housing as well. But now I believe the complete opposite, which is only by creating housing for everybody who wants to live here can we really have that just and livable California that we want. So, yeah, the effect of Measure A. It passed in 1973, and we know it's being offered to us on repeal as Measure Z this November. It's 47 years, and that's a long time. And many people who voted for it are gone, and many who live now in Alameda don't even know what it is. But over all those years, it's been known. Measure A, 1973, Article 26, is what it is in the charter. Measure Z is the repeal. And if I mix it up like Rasheed does, it's because Measure Z is still sort of a new word to us. We can't help it. I hope we don't confuse it. I hope nobody's confused. It became a very powerful weapon, and both as a legal block to multifamily housing and as a social and political tool to keep the city council in line and resist change to any perception of what Alameda's character was about. So Rasheed talked about how its passage played into housing discrimination, displacement, the idea that it enshrined the past practices is really very good. I would say it put a suburban overlay over Alameda, kind of made it into a pseudo suburb when it wasn't, but his words are really accurate. It really enshrined past practices, so it was a very clear statement. So anyway, I'm going to step back and talk about Renewed Hope, which began in 1998. And that was kind of all the various patterns of displacement, one of them occurred in 1998, and you've all heard of the dot-com boom. So it really hit the West End where the Harbor Island apartments where Rasheed was living at the time. I think he was still there before they were all evicted in 2004. So there was a lot of crisis there. A lot of people were being pushed out back then. And as he said, there were white people left that neighborhood and Black people, low income people moved in. And at this point in 1998, the rents were forcing them out. And right across the street from the Harbor Island apartments along Atlantic Avenue, there was this abandoned Navy housing, 500 units of it. And a developer had come into the city called Catellus, and they were proposing to tear them down and build a suburban housing, Bayport, all it confirmed it. It went along with Measure A, and people saw the writing on the wall. And one of them was Vicki Smith, who grew up in the Estuary Project, and her family had actually managed to stay in Alameda after many people were forced out. She was a longtime activist, and she kind of alerted the folks at the Buena Vista United Methodist Church, who under Japanese American church traditionally, who under Reverend Michael Yoshi were very committed to social justice. And so she alerted them, and they actually had a first meeting with the city manager at the time, and he said, gentrification is going to wash over Alameda like a wave, and there's nothing you can do about it. Well, those were fighting words, and Renewed Hope was formed. And so we took our name. I came in a little later. We took our name from Hope, housing opportunities provided equally, that was so active in Alameda, beginning with the fair housing fights of the 1960s all the way into the 80s, when they started to help tenants in the 80s. So we became Renewed Hope, and it seemed, and so our basic demand was, why do we tear down 500 units of 3 and 4 bedroom, decent family housing? I mean, it was run down, but it could be rehabilitated. Why are we tearing them down to build 500 single family expensive homes in the middle of a rent crisis, in the middle of displacement? Well, we were strong, and there were probably like 200 people in Renewed Hope at the time, and we had all kinds of demonstrations, but basically the council wasn't here going to have anything of it. So we lost that battle. And so we had to regroup, and our new strategy was, well, we were a smaller group then, and we had a base closure nonprofit consultant, very smart woman named Eve Bach from Berkeley. She always got trashed at council because she was from Berkeley. And she told us that the ERRs were, on all the bases, were inadequate, and with a simple lawsuit, we could start to make some real demands. So that's what we did. We sued. We sued the city. We sued Catellus. The judge knew that we didn't care about the EIR. He says, "What do you really want?" And we said, 25% affordable housing at the base, please. And that's what we got. So we have a settlement agreement that forces the city to do that at the former Navy base, which we now call Alameda Point. So that was 2001 when we got that victory, and we were only now getting the housing. That tells you something. Because we were stuck with, guess what? Article 26, Measure A. So 2 developers who came in to try to develop the base couldn't do it, because trying to make affordable housing all single family is impossible. It's very expensive. So they walked away. In fact, one of them, SunCal, actually sponsored a ballot proposition in 2010 to try and lift Measure A just on the base. And the council, of course, fearing the total wrath of the community, would not put it on the ballot itself. So they had to pay for signature gathering. And that looked pretty bad to begin with. But then we realized in Renewed Hope that the initiative itself would have cemented the development agreement for the base, which meant that the city would have no more control. The developer would do whatever they wanted. Even if they did try to do the affordable housing, we didn't know what kind of games they would play, and we couldn't support it. So unfortunately, Measure B lost by a landslide pretty much. And it also revealed how the council's refusal to deal with Article 26 was really stalling the development of the base. Okay, so the base development's not going anywhere. And so we turned our focus to the housing element law. And again, Eve told us, that's another suit that's not that hard. And I think what kept us back all those years is we were really afraid. I mean, the Measure A people would come out to council meetings pretty strong. So it was a little scary, but she kept explaining to us that the state housing element law says basically, you have to have adequate sites for affordable housing. You have to meet, in those sites, you have to meet your regional housing allocation numbers, which come through ABAG, called the RENA. And you can't have any impediments. You can't just put out sites and say, oh, this is a good site, but because if it's contaminated or whatever, then it's not a good site. And the housing ban made it impossible. In fact, the city had an element that they had submitted to the state saying that that all the sites could be on the Navy base, and that Article 26 was not an impediment because clearly we had so much affordable housing in Alameda because we had so many renters and other sham arguments, and the state didn't buy it and neither did we. But the only problem there is the state doesn't enforce the housing element. It leaves it kind of stopped short of doing that when it was passed. So it left it to community groups and other people to insist. So we were looking at the city of Pleasanton that had sued. It had a successful suit. And so we also saw the council. The council only had one strong member in favor of Article 26. That 3 of 4 council members weren't white, and they were beginning to understand social justice pretty well. But they were kind of afraid too. So there was kind of a signals that went back and forth that if we would take the heat and we would sue, they would be happy. So we got EBHO, of course, as our allies, and we got some public interest lawyers. And in 2012, we sent them a demand letter, and the city pretty much swung into action, and we all worked together for 6 months and got a housing element, which was passed in 2012. And the council actually was pretty happy. And for some reason, the Measure A people, they showed up, but they weren't very strong, and they sort of seemed to be petering out at the time. So basically we have, now that we have the element, we have sites along Alameda's northern waterfront near the estuary and the West End. There really are very few sites in the rest of the town. So that might be why the opposition wasn't really strong. We have in the last few years, we've now approved 4 or 5 major market rate projects, all with multifamily with affordable housing included. I mean, it looks to the opponents of Measure Z like there's not enough affordable housing, but really we have a lot more than we ever had. And I like to say the people who live in those units are thankful. They know they are welcomed in Alameda. That's the strongest indication that we're a welcoming city, is those affordable units. And that's what we must always remember. We have weakened Article 26, but we don't need it at all. And there's 2 reasons. I mean, for one thing, it blocks the city's ability to rezone the commercial areas. It blocks their ability to be creative with housing, make it sustainable. There are a few pockets in the city where we could do some real creativity, build 4plexes, courtyard housing, apartments over retail. And as somebody said recently, we get the kind of community we want, not the ones the voters of 1973 wanted. But, you know, it removes from the city charter policy that made the city's neighborhoods more exclusive and expensive. But, you know, it's really, you know, the really important thing is that it has, as Rasheed said, it's a policy of institutional racism. It supports institutional racism, and we really can't have that anymore. In our city charter, it's like the Constitution. I mean, to me, that's the strongest argument. Other people get into all the technicalities. Would it provide affordable housing? Would it do this? Would it do that? It's racist. We should get rid of it. That should not be who we are in 2020. And as Rasheed said, if you want Black lives to matter, and if you really want Alameda to be a welcoming city, it's a contradiction to do anything but vote yes on Measure A. And you know, it'll be an act of healing, and it really will honor those that are gone. And I think of the people every day that are no longer in Alameda, who should have been here all these decades. I think it's sad. And I think a lot of people don't realize that when they look at Alameda, that there are the ghosts of those that we did not allow to stay here. Okay, I want to thank you all for listening to me, for letting me give you a small part of Alameda's social justice history, which is huge, and it's one of not giving up. And I want to invite you all to a town hall that the Alameda Justice Alliance will be putting on October 3rd in this sort of same virtual format. And we were going to take the view that Measure A is going to pass, and what kind of community are we going to be in the future? It's called Building the Beloved Community Beyond Z. And we're hoping to start a discussion on how proper planning can actually strengthen our bonds as a community, lessen our fears, and give us hope for our children's future, because that's what we're all about. right? Oh, Rasheed will be speaking. Michael Yoshi will be speaking. We're going to have some Mission Economic Development Association land use analysts talk about things that are happening in the mission to keep people in community, fight gentrification and all those sort of things. And we're hoping it's a beginning. It's a beginning. So anyway, thank you for listening to me, and tell all your friends we have to, pass Measure Z, get rid of Measure A, Article 26, and move forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. That was really very valuable. Laura, there's a question, which is what time on the 3rd is this event?
Oh, it'll be at 10 in the morning. If you go to alamedajustice.org, that's our website, you can sign up there. And we'll try to put it out on Facebook as often as we can in other places. And maybe Ebo can help us out a bit with that. But that's the best place for now, alamedajustice.org. And there's a little button there that says Town Hall 3, because it's our 3rd town hall. We did one on the Wellness Center, and last year that was really good and helped pass the Wellness Center. Anyhow, hope to see you all there.
Excellent. Thank you. 3 people have shared links. I really appreciate how on it this group of Yes on Z people is on everything involving technology. The next question is, and this might be for Laura, but also I know that Imber, Galen, or Rasheed might be able to answer this. The first question is, how is Measure Z polling right now? Do we have information on this? Who feels empowered to answer that?
Not me. I don't know.
I'd love to know. When Prop 14 was passed, and that was, a state law that overturned the Fair Housing Act, the Run for Fair Housing Act, there was a study done in Berkeley where they looked at racial attitudes and people renters, what was the religion, and I'd love to just be able to read something like that. I think it was 73% of Alamedans or more supported Prop 14. I don't know why. So, I do have links to Qualtrics. If someone wants to craft a survey and help distribute it, would love to be able to incorporate that for my own knowledge. But I don't have any information.
It looks like John Knox White is on this call and has his hand raised. Can you answer that?
Thank you. I appreciate this event and everybody who's here. I actually wanted to just shout out, we have a member of our planning board who came, which I greatly appreciate. So thank you to Ron Curtis for coming and participating. To the specific question, there is no polling. To do a really meaningful poll, it's about $25,000, and we've decided to actually spend our efforts just talking to the community, because we're confident that in meaningful conversation and dialogue that people really are getting this and whatnot, but there isn't any polling being done right now, so there's no specific answer to that question.
Thank you. And John, we have one more question for you. If you could turn your camera back on.
I'm back.
Sophia answered the question. Well, the answer to the question is who supports Z on the current city council and which candidates? And EBHO, I just want everyone to know, EBHO does not endorse candidates. We do endorse propositions. And John Knox White is an Alameda City Council member and chair of this here campaign. So could you please name who on council currently supports it? And
Absolutely. I would say I'm one of the co-chairs for the campaign. Our mayor, Izzy Ashcraft, is the other co-chair with me. So obviously the two of us support. The other two other city council members, Jim Odie and Malia Vela, also support it. They are also candidates in this upcoming election, and they're the only 2 candidates in this election who are supporting Measure Z. I will say, interestingly, all of the school board candidates who are participating in public forums, there's one who has not shown up, and so I won't speak for him, but all the rest of them have come out in favor of Measure Z as well.
Thank you. Are there other questions?
If I can really quickly go over it there.
Yeah.
there's some weird like storytelling about, who the city council candidates were in 1973 and how that connects to, Measure A then. And I think it's just really interesting to see how people have positioned themselves in relationship to Measure Z. And so, if anything else can be, I think it's really a litmus test for who is concerned about racial justice in Alameda, who's concerned about housing justice in Alameda. And so see where people sit on this measure and their rationale, and that'll tell you a lot about them and who they represent in Alameda, or who they may be seeking to represent.
Yes, thank you. Okay, I ask everyone on here to.
Can I make one more
Oh,
comment?
yeah, go ahead.
I'm not an elected official, so I can say probably some very different things. I see someone referring to someone as the usual abstainer in the chat, and I think it's really interesting that the one council member who is against, sitting council member who's against Measure Z is leading that the No on Z campaign, but was also on the city council when the East Housing was taken down, and was a supporter of essentially gentrification, and has said as much, and so wanted to have, to get rid of potential workforce housing, and contributed to the repopulation of the West End, and was also on the city council when we were forced out of the Buena Vista apartments in Alameda. And so I think it's just, you can look at people's records and look at the positions they take, and then I think you can use that to decide what position will you take.
Kiki asked the question, what is the messaging for No on Measure Z?
Well,
Anyone want to take a swing at that?
I'm watching it on social media, and it's there seems to be a lot of fear of traffic, fear of not enough infrastructure. It's just fear that's not very grounded, and big assertions that taking away Measure A will not provide affordable housing, which is the one that makes me go ballistic. Because I don't understand how everybody's a born again affordable housing expert all of a sudden. So I think what it is that there is a sense of privilege and fear of losing that. And so the only boogeyman you can point to is we're not getting enough affordable housing for those poor people. We're going to sit on our righteous high horse and say, we want ours, but we don't want anybody else in here unless we're going to be doing this one good thing, and you people aren't doing it well enough. So there's that one that's very, very weird. I'll let other people speak.
I saw John turned his camera back on.
Go for it.
No, I'm not stepping in front of you, Rasheed. You were speaking. Go.
Oh, go ahead, Rasheed.
It's fear. And I think, it's an interesting way of tapping into the local version of the national rhetoric we're seeing around fear and law and order. So where you have, President Trump repealing the affirmative fair housing, affirmatively furthering fair housing, and talking about, low income people coming to your suburbs, and, defunding the police. I think we see some similar rhetoric from some individuals in this campaign. And so that's one element of it. And then I think the other is really the developer as the boogeyman. And so, developer is, I think people have a certain connotation of it, in the same way that I hear politician and I might think a certain thing. And I think that, there is this idea of, well, once you get rid of Measure A, you're going to tear down my home and build a skyscraper. That's sort of some silly rhetoric that's coming out.
John, this is the last comment I'm going to take before moving us on to the next.
No, you
section.
go ahead. I think that fear is definitely it. I was just going to acknowledge that I think what you see is a lot of acknowledgement that Article 26 is problematic, and but a requirement that you guarantee nothing will change if you get rid of it, which is, I think, what I would say is you see an internal struggle to try to maintain a lot of people's personal comfort all at the same time trying to acknowledge it's a problem. They just want guarantees that nothing will change, and that's that's not a dismissive thing. It's just it's a struggle that I think people have to go through, and have some trust that the world will continue to be a good place.
Yeah, thank you. So building off of the Alameda Justice Alliance and hope that Alameda will be a good place, we at EBHO have been working on strengthening our collective visioning muscle of what can be when we win. And Measure Z is one step in the many steps that we need to take to truly create the affordable housing that we need here in the Bay Area and Alameda for low-income communities who are suffering and bearing the brunt of this housing market that is economically harmful and predominantly harms Black and brown and disabled low-income people. And so if you will join us in closing your eyes or turning off your screen, or holding your child as they need something, but you take a moment to just reflect for 1 minute, and imagine once Measure Z passes and we have a robust community process about housing should be built in Alameda and what it will cost, and how it can be affordable, and we secure the funding that we need to build all of the affordable housing that we need, including at the very low income levels. What will Alameda look and feel like? Let's just take 1 minute. So I'm going to ask us to return to each other here in this Zoom space. And Kiki of EBHO says that's one of our places to buy a home. So it looks like we'll be raising our family as a queer POC family, and it feels like freedom. Thank you. I am a parent of 2 young children, and I often worry about families who I can see are struggling because there's 2 and 3 and 4 children living in a family in a 1-bedroom apartment. And especially now that we are homeschooling, that's stress on those children that doesn't need to be happening. So in my vision, one thing that came to me was children with space in their homes because they can afford a home size to what they need. Any other contributions?
I was trying to find these 2 interesting quotes from my undergrad thesis that's available online. I'll share with y'all. It's kind of dated now, but it's still new. But 2 things came to mind. One was from Michael Rawson, who's an attorney who sued the city with Modesta Henderson and Clayton Guyton in 1989. And he said, we hope this lawsuit will go some ways in showing that Alameda is not just like the exclusive domain of the rich, something of that nature. And so I think that shift in the reality and mentality is one. And then secondly, in 2004, I was a part of a group of young people who worked with the city to conduct a survey for the West Alameda Improvement Project. And the first question on the survey, which all of my neighbors looked at real crazy, it said, does living in a racially, economically, and socially diverse community cause problems for residents? And I would hope we can live in an Alameda that can be racially, socially, and economically diverse, and it's not seen as a problem. And so having integrated neighborhoods where different people have access to more trees and schools that are better resourced, and live on non-toxic land would be part of that vision. People who have been repeatedly forced out having a right to return is part of the vision. And having alternate methods of having increased access to ownership, and then alternative forms of ownership on colonized land, occupied land. So what might that look like to have community land trust for people who've been displaced, or tenants in common? So just having some of these things that have been not extended to all of us being a reality in the future is part of my vision.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. There's some great comments in the chat. Danielle lifts up, I think about the new opportunities to enhance our downtown shopping districts, improve transit options, and a more diverse, integrated community. Sophia says, more accessible housing and the opportunity to visit friends in Alameda. Sherry says, I'm a senior and would love to live in a small cottage. And Ezra says, I want everyone to have what I have, a nice apartment in a 9-unit old Victorian in a diverse block. Everyone deserves that. There's more in the comments. Please read and keep contributing. And we're going to move on. I'm going to invite Galen now to talk with you about how you can plug into action to support Measure Z and help get it passed so we can move on to the next step of funding and creating the affordable housing that we need.
Great, thank you. Everyone, I just
We can't hear you.
There we go. So I just put in the chat the link to join the Measure Z campaign. The best thing you can do is to follow that link and share your contact information so that we can reach out to you. I'd love for you all to request a lawn sign, particularly if you are on the corner in a busy Alameda street. It's always good to have that visibility. There are also other options. There is phone banking. There's phone banking tonight. We've got phone banking. I think we've got 30 more sessions, and if you haven't done Call Hub phone banking, it is easy and fun, and I have had great conversations with voters in Alameda already. Another thing you can do in addition to phone banking and a lawn sign is you can sign up for text banking. If we've got some space available, we'll start doing that again soon. We've already reached out to a bunch of people. I would also say if you are connected with the Alameda Justice Alliance, they are doing a lit drop this weekend. If someone who's connected with them could drop that link in the chat, it would be helpful. They are doing a drop for not only Measure Z, but also candidates. So you'll need to be comfortable with those candidates as well. Those candidates happen to be in support of Measure Z. So I think they're the right choices. And I think that is really what you can do. Two more things. One, if you have some extra cash lying around, campaigns cost money, so you can donate at that site. And last and not least, talk to your neighbors, talk to your friends. When someone has a question, when they bring one of those fear-based questions to you, put their mind at ease, remind them that Article 26 needs to go from our charter, and it will begin a process that engages the community, and we get to see and envision what our city looks like. The voters of 1973 who said yes to Measure A don't get to control our city forever. So those are the things that you can do. I'm really glad you all showed up to hear this today. So thank you. I can't wait to see you on the phone bank. I can't wait to see those lawn signs. I think we're going to win with you guys.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And we are excited that you're going to go to the ballots. And also we are advocating hard for the funding that we need in our communities to have healthy, connected, thriving communities. And for us, we're especially highlighting Prop 15, California Prop 15, which is Schools and Communities First, which will take property taxes for corporations that were fixed to scale slowly back when the measure was passed, and it will allow reassessment based on current values. And then that is an influx of a significant amount of money that has been paused. And also we are encouraging people to vote yes and also join the work to pass Alameda County Measure W. And so if you go to our website, our election central part of our website, if Sophia could drop that in the chat, we have information about how to connect on all of these measures at the local, county, and state level. And finally, East Bay Housing Organization is a membership organization, and our membership is a valuable and unique collaboration of people from various walks of life that are often not in the same rooms with each other. So residents of affordable housing and staff of affordable housing providers and people who have been activists in their communities for 1 year or 20 years sit at tables and discuss things like this, like what are the impact of zoning and how does it affect our communities, and what do we think needs to happen so that our communities can have the affordable housing that they need. And we work through committees. Mostly we have a regional policy committee that our Alameda members are often active in, some of them on this call. And we also have member only events. And so please join us, become a member for the year ahead. And we'd love to see you again in future meetings, our website, our social media. So please stay connected, and yes on Z, let's do this, let's win. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Grover. Thank you all.
Yes, thank you, Rasheed and Laura.
No, you're welcome. It's been exciting as usual, and I hope we win. We should.
Yes, and drop whatever your handles in the chat if you want people to connect with you.
Mhm.
And our guests are slowly saying goodbye. Thank you. I don't have my phone on to play sweet tunes like I planned.
Right. Well, thank
Yeah.
you, Grover.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon. Stay safe. Get those lawn signs out.
Really? Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.